Hello and welcome to the Brittle Society series of podcasts. I'm Corinne Keldy, the Support Development Officer, and today I'm joined by Dr. Meena Balasubramanian, a clinical geneticist from Sheffield Children's Hospital and also a member of our Medical Advisory Board. Hi Dr. Balasubramanian, thank you so much for agreeing to join us today and talk about genetics and osteogenesis imperfecta. Can I start by asking you to describe osteogenesis imperfecta as a geneticist?
It mainly is characterized by fragile bones that break easily, but as we've understood the spectrum of osteogenesis imperfecta, we realize that it is not all about the bones. There are several other aspects to the condition that we often come across. As a geneticist, we are interested in looking at the entire spectrum of presentation in osteogenesis imperfecta, also commonly known as brittle bone disease. And what we normally say is that there is a huge spectrum of presentation with osteogenesis imperfecta. So you can have patients that present with normal adult stature and hardly any fractures, to the other end of the extreme where you could have a couple that present in the pregnancy with scans that have identified short, long bones and fractures early on. So it is a very variable condition, and that can sometimes come down to the genetics of it, which I'll hopefully go into a little bit more detail later on.
So could you maybe explain a little bit then about how does OI remain a clinical diagnosis, and when is genetic testing generally indicated?
So when we talk about osteogenesis imperfecta, it used to be traditionally a clinical diagnosis in that when a child presented to clinic with a fracture history of often following very little trauma, then, if there were clinical features that to go with OI, so for example, if the child presented with bluish appearance to the whites of their eyes, so blue sclerae, or bluish-gray sclerae, and the teeth, there was dentinogenesis imperfecta, then often it remained a clinical diagnosis. The clinicians often took a family pedigree to find out if there were other affected members of the family. And depending on the severity of the condition, if there was a milder clinical presentation, then it was often clinically diagnosed as osteogenesis imperfecta, and no further genetic testing was undertaken. However, with more advanced genetic technologies, which means that testing is becoming more accessible, what is happening more and more is genetic testing is happening on a more larger scale. So what we're finding is that although in the milder presentations it still remains a clinical diagnosis, in the more sort of severe end of the spectrum, or where there is a clinical question regarding the diagnosis, then genetic testing is happening.
So the next question I have for you, Dr. Balasubramanian, is what are the different ways in which OI can actually be inherited?
So I earlier on said that OI is a genetic condition that is often inherited. So what do I mean by that? In 85% of patients, what we find is that it follows an autosomal dominant pattern of inheritance. So this is where you may have an affected parent, and there could be a family history of this. So before I go any further, if I could just touch upon some basic genetics. What we often say is that we carry 20,000 pairs of genes within each of the cells in our body. And they come in pairs because you inherit one copy from mother and one copy from father. Now, we all carry certain faults within our genes, and it's important to remember that. But usually these faults don't matter because we've got a normal backup copy that kind of makes up for it. Now, sometimes you can have an individual who's got a faulty copy of the gene that's dominating over the normal copy, and this produces symptoms. So in this particular case, it could be fracture of bones, joint hyperextensibility, etc. So if an individual with such a dominant faulty copy of the gene goes on to have children, they could either pass on their normal copy or the faulty copy of the gene, and the other parent would always pass on their normal copy of the gene. So as you can see, there's a 50% or 1 in 2 chance of passing on this sort of dominant faulty copy of the gene to any children they have. So this is often referred to as an autosomal dominant pattern of inheritance. And interestingly now, why 85% of patients seem to follow this pattern of inheritance. So that's the most common pattern that we talk about in OI. So when I say we carry 20,000 pairs of genes, and I said faulty copy, I suppose what I mean is there can be a spelling mistake in the gene whereby the code may not be read correctly in some situations. So that's what I am going to here on refer to as a faulty copy of a gene. It doesn't technically mean that it's a faulty copy. It just means that there is a spelling mistake in the gene that is making the code not being read properly. And basically, all these genes encode for a protein which has got a specific function in the body. And if these gene codes are not read correctly, then the protein that ends up being formed is not always formed correctly. And that can often be the underlying molecular basis for some of these conditions. This would be the same with OI. And here we're talking about type 1 collagen, which is the main protein that's involved in OI. What's important to remember with autosomal dominant inheritance is there are a few exceptions to the rule. So we come on to what's called de novo pattern of inheritance. So this is a situation where the variant in the gene starts for the first time in the child, so it's not present in either of the parent. So we use the word de novo inheritance for this. So when that particular child who's got the de novo faulty copy goes on to have children, then they would pass on the dominant faulty copy of the gene to any children they have. So that would then follow an autosomal dominant pattern of inheritance. But for the parents with a child with a de novo gene fault, they would be at a much lesser risk of passing it on. So it's not going to be 50%. It's going to be more in the region of 7%. And that's because although they've tested negative for this gene fault, it's possible that the proportion of their sperms or eggs carry the gene fault without it being present in the rest of the parent. So we use the word gonadal mosaicism for this. So it's important to think about these various patterns of inheritance when it comes to the genetics in OI and what is the risk of having a child with OI.
Are there any other ways it can be passed on or inherited?
Yes, that's right, Corinne. So I talked about the autosomal dominant pattern of inheritance, which is the commonest form, and the de novo situations where it can start for the first time in a child. Now, that was always traditionally thought to be the main patterns of inheritance in Osteogenesis Imperfecta. But what we now know with sort of more recent advances in genetic technology is there are a couple of other forms as well. So we know about the autosomal recessive form of OI. And this is a situation where both parents are carriers of faulty copy each, but it doesn't matter to their own health because they've got a normal backup copy. But in a situation where these two parents come together and have children, they've got a 1 in 4 or 25% chance of passing on both the faulty copies of the gene to any child they have. And again, this would be regardless of the birth order or the sex of the child. So you can imagine a situation where one parent could pass on the normal copy, the other parent could pass on their faulty copy. So the child's a healthy carrier, just like the parent, or the other way around. Or both of them pass on the normal copies, so the child's fine. But in a situation where both of them pass on their faulty copy of the gene, the child would have a recessive form of the condition. And usually with recessive forms of OI, they tend to be a more severe end of the spectrum, may present in pregnancy, and could be detected on antenatal scans. So again, this is a situation where genetic testing is often indicated to find out if this is a recessive form of OI. In fact, historically, some of the more severe sort of lethal forms of OI have now been reclassified as possibly recessive forms of OI. The other pattern of inheritance that we also know about is the X-linked osteoporosis, where it could be more severe presentation in boys compared to girls. So when we talk about this, we say that girls carry 2 X chromosomes, while boys carry an X and a Y chromosome. So if there is a fault on a gene on the X chromosome, a woman tends to be a carrier, whereas as boys or men do not have a backup copy of the X chromosome, they present with more severe features of the condition. So we know of a couple of genes in osteoporosis stroke osteogenesis imperfecta where they can present in a more severe form in boys. So what's interesting as the genetics of osteogenesis imperfecta has evolved is we've realized that all the different patterns of inheritance that we know of in genetics can also happen in OI. And that's perhaps one of the reasons it is important to seek genetic advice, especially if there needs to be clarity around diagnosis and management.
Okay, that's explaining how the different ways the genes and that work. But one of the questions I get asked quite a lot as support officer is how does a family go about seeking genetic advice and actually getting that initial diagnosis? And that could be from parents with babies just being born and they're still waiting on a diagnosis, or there's maybe a little bit of dubiety about what the diagnosis might be. And then, as you say, you've got families that may be older people looking at starting a family up as well, and they're maybe not had genetic testing done, and they're looking to get genetic testing done before they start a family. So how do people actually go about seeking that advice, and in what situations would you recommend getting a referral?
I think in terms of seeking genetic advice, it should be available to any family that are wanting to know more information and wanting to know what the diagnosis for their child is and whether there is anything more that can be offered. So in terms of seeking genetic advice, what I would often say to families is to contact their local GP surgery and ask to be referred to their local genetic service. And at that point, hopefully, once they get referred to the local genetic service, then they could go through the information such as, looking into the child's medical history, the clinical presentation, taking an extended family pedigree. So we often take a 3-generation family pedigree to find out information about variable presentations within the family, etc. And then if it can be a confident clinical diagnosis based on the child's presenting problems and the medical history as well as the extended family information they've obtained, then that's fine. I think in terms of genetic testing, that would usually be reserved for situations where there is a question regarding the clinical diagnosis, especially if the presentation is atypical. So, for example, if the child has sustained several unexplained fractures following low trauma, but it is not very typical of an OI. And, for example, if the child did not have any of the extraskeletal features that we would often associate with OI, then that would be a situation where genetic testing is performed. In terms of where would we recommend referral to the clinical genetic service, again, I see a lot of children with osteogenesis imperfecta where parents are asking the question, what is the chance of having another child with the condition? Or, where there is questions about the clinical diagnosis and parents want to seek more clarity around that. I'm also starting to see a lot of young adults with OI coming in asking for recurrence risk information, as well as wanting genetic testing to find out if there are options available to them to prevent them from passing on the OI to their children. So these would be the situations where we would normally recommend referral as well as genetic testing to give the family options regarding decision making.
Thanks for that. Just to pick up on something, is it possible to diagnose genetically prenatally?
Yes, it is possible to do diagnosis prenatally. It depends on what gestation in the pregnancy that the couple present with. And again, with recent advances in genetics, what we are able to now do is targeted gene panels. So there are a lot of recent advances where there are prenatal exomes or prenatal targeted skeletal gene panels that include most of the genes that causes OI, and we'd be able to specifically look for this in the pregnancy. I suppose it would have to involve very careful discussions with the couple around genetic counseling, around making sure that they understand the implications of the genetic testing, what results might come about, and what sort of decision making that would involve subsequently. So it needs to be a multidisciplinary team input with the feto-maternal team, the obstetric team, the genetics team, and making sure that the couple are on board with information around why the genetic testing is happening and what will be the implications of the results, and have they thought about what they would do subsequently.
Thank you. That was excellent information, Dr. Balasubramanian, and really I can't thank you enough for giving up your time today and joining us. That was really, really useful and really informative. Thank you. So if you would like to find out more about osteogenesis imperfecta and more information on the topic of genetics, please visit our website, brittlebone.org. Thank you for listening.